We've seen how the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew is the core passage for the fundamental teachings of Jesus as a theorist of justice, to see into his way of thinking about the purpose of being human and the kinds of dignity that inhere in all human beings. And so the Sermon on the Mount presents us Jesus as not only a thinker about the law, but specifically what it means to have dignity and what is the purpose of human life. Righteousness, but a kind of righteousness that is internal transformation and that it manifests itself as love of others. To understand what these mean in terms of a theory of law and justice, and specifically to understand what it means to say that Jesus is a kind of universalist philosopher, the fact that Jesus believes that our moral commitments extend to all of humanity, regardless of various kinds of communal or status affiliation, we need to look at an encounter that Jesus has with a lawyer who asks him about the nature of justice in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10. But to do so, we need to situate the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is written by a Gentile Christian, that is, by a Christian who was not born into Judaism, but in fact is born as a Gentile, raised as a Gentile, a Greek who worships the Greek gods. And Luke, in particular, was probably a follower, a convert of the great Christian missionary Paul. And to understand the Gospel of Luke, it has to be seen as part of Paul's mission, as an outcome of Paul's mission and Paul's particular vision of Christianity. Paul was a Jew, born and raised as a Jew and deeply learned and trained as a Pharisee, that is, as a Jew who was deeply knowledgeable about the Jewish law. And in the very earliest days of Christianity, after the crucifixion of Jesus, Paul was, in fact, a persecutor of the Christian faith. That is, that he was somehow appointed by the temple authorities in Jerusalem to try and stop the spread of this teaching that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ. Paul, though, had a conversion experience on the road to Damascus that he himself describes in his own letters and that is outlined in the book of Acts. Paul converts to the Christian faith and becomes a missionary for the Christian religion, for the view that Jesus was the Messiah. Paul, though, sees himself as a missionary who has come to spread the religion to the Gentiles. And this would make Paul a very controversial figure in his own day. Jesus is Jewish. His disciples are Jewish. And though there are signs in the Gospels that already during his ministry, during his life, Jesus began to approach non-Jews, nevertheless, the religion of Christianity comes directly out of Judaism. Paul believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, who had been sent to earth to reconcile non-Jews and Jews, to bring Gentiles back into the salvation of God. Now, Paul spread the religion, the belief in Jesus as the Messiah, throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world. He was a traveling missionary who would take the message of the gospel to the cities of the Greeks throughout the Roman Empire. And as he would do so, he would bring into the new faith those who were not raised within Judaism, who were not practicing or observant Jews, who didn't obey the Jewish law, meaning that they didn't practice circumcision, that they didn't observe the Sabbath, that they didn't practice kosher or table purity, all the ritual elements of the Jewish law which were completely alien to the Greeks and Romans of the Mediterranean. And Paul's form of Christianity said that such Gentiles could become part of the religion, could have salvation without obeying all of the elements of the Mosaic law. And so Paul's vision of Christianity was that the salvation that was offered through Jesus as the Christ superseded, in some ways that it rendered obsolete, or in his words, freed Christians from the requirements of the law. And this gospel, this form of the Christian religion, was extremely controversial in Paul's day. And in fact, most of the texts of the New Testament are written against the background of this controversy over Gentile Christianity. Because most of Jesus' followers, especially those who had been near to him in his life, initially believed that in fact this is not the purpose of Jesus' gospel, to displace the entire law of Moses that has been at the heart of the covenant with Israel for centuries. How could that possibly be the purpose of the Jewish Messiah? And so Paul's gospel is highly controversial. Nevertheless, over his lifetime, Paul gradually prevails, and his vision of Gentile Christianity becomes the dominant form of the Christian religion. And this in itself is radical, because it means that now there is to be no distinction between Jew and Gentile, but all are to be reconciled with God. And the Gospel of Luke, in particular, among all the Gospels, emphasizes this element of Christianity. The Gospel of Luke, in fact, was originally part of a 2-volume work that we can call Luke Acts. The Gospel of Luke is written by the same author as the book of Acts. The books are meant to be read together, and they cohere in their message. And that message is symbolized in the geographic trajectory of the book of Luke Acts. It begins in Jerusalem and ends in Rome, the universal city, the capital of empire, symbolizing the idea that the covenant has now transcended Jerusalem and come to embody humanity as a whole. And through all of its episodes, the Gospel of Luke emphasizes this message, that Jesus has come as a universal Savior. And so, for instance, compare the genealogies in Matthew and Luke. The Gospel of Matthew emphasizes Jesus' Judaism. It portrays Jesus as the fulfillment of the Jewish law. And the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew runs from Abraham down to Jesus. The genealogy in the Gospel of Luke runs from Jesus back to Adam, the original ancestor of all mankind in Jewish teaching. And so even in something as simple as the genealogies, you can see the different emphases that the gospel authors place on the meaning of Jesus' message. Jesus could be both the fulfillment of the Jewish law, but also a universal Savior. And the teachings of Luke, in particular, emphasize the universality of Christian salvation.